Alrighty, welcome back to the second half of iNN's Headlines and Beyond for April 3rd, 2012. We were talking about the functional and the philosophical differences between the right and left, between the Republicans and the Democrats. Uh, this is in particular not only to the what's going on in the primaries now, but how policies play out and the arguments of policy play out. One of the things that needs to be understood is that that the one of the problems that the right is having and they're not necessarily the right. Republicans now form a large chunk. They're sort of a mosaic of different groups. They're not one cohesive group the way the Democrats are. The Democrats have become this new cohesive group. Primarily, they're now centered around socialism, and although they say they have and support different thoughts and ideas, if you sit down and you really look at their belief structure and how they think about things, they're all surrounding the academic, intellectual, socialist views. And there really isn't much of a departure from them. So primarily you have the Obama group, who are the concept intellectuals, that everything is a concept. They're more on the socialist communist left side of things, and they are more atheistic than the second group of socialists, who are still social. These are the environmentalists, uh, who are what we would call the neo-socialists, meaning they're a new type of socialists, that rather than being atheistic, they're agnostic, meaning that rather than saying that there is no God, they have a view that there might be a God, and what they do is they have a tendency, rather than going for traditional religions, they will move out to earth-based or tribal religions, and they will find the neo-socialism is really a neo-tribalism. It's going back to the tribe, and you'll see these people. They have you look and go into any of these environmental rallies, and find the hardcore environmentalists. If they have a tribal tattoo or tribal piercing, then you're seeing somebody who is more agnostic and is tending towards more of this sort of neo-tribalism in terms of the socialism, as opposed to the traditional atheistic, purely intellectual socialist. And this is sort of the dynamic that has formed in the Democratic Party, and so there's really not much of a sort of, if you want to call, a major philosophical divide. There are minor divides, but they're not major sort of philosophical divides, particularly for the Obama group, who are more or less called, even though they call themselves Christians or whatever, they have a religion. They're not really religious, and their view of religion is more of a concept or a philosophy than it is a religion. And I should say that their religion, and this is where I need to make the qualifier now, is that religion is how you practice your belief. So there's two components. There's the theology, and then there's the religion. The theology states what you actually believe, and the religion is how you practice what you believe. So, in the case of Obama and the atheists, what they believe, their theology, is that there is no God, and they practice accordingly. Because they have yet to this point in time proven there isn't a God. They're continually trying, but until they do prove that there is no God, their statement of disbelief in God is still a belief. So their theology is an atheology. It's a theology of God that with no God in it, that the God doesn't exist, and their religion extends from there on out as they practice it. Into this comes the view of the world that many of the nihilists, the anarchists, and other forms of existentialism have taken, that the entire world that we see here is a matter of perception and concept, and this includes gender and all these gender issues are as they are because gender is simply a perception. It's a concept and not reality, and this forms the nihilist view, this forms the anarchist view, this forms the existential view along these lines of nihilism and anarchism, that everything is more or less just simply a concept. And into this concept comes now a huge umbrella that religions, or so-called religions, can be pulled into. And this includes anyone who calls themselves a particular religion, like Christian or whatever, but doesn't actually practice it. They believe in the concepts of this particular religion, but when you sit down and look at how they approach this and their approach to the religion, you'll find that the practices, the religion itself, rather than being supporting a specific theology, is more conceptual. So the theology becomes more conceptual in addition to their practices. And so what happens, they become concept Christians, they become concept Muslims, or whatever particular background they are that they say, or religious belief that they say that they have. So a large chunk of what's going on the left in terms of the Democratic Party doesn't become opposed if you are of the view that everything is a concept and they come up with a term that's all good. That there's no problem, all concepts, all forms of reality are accepted, that there's no discrimination here, everything's all right, and it's all a hunky-dory little party. This is the view of the left. The Republican view is and this is what we call the view on the right, is one of, there is a particular set of values, that theology does matter, that what theology that you do have does matter, even though you can live side by side with other people of other different theological bases, theological ideology. And this is sort of where it gets a little murky, because theologies say you can and you can't. And we'll get into this a little bit later on, but this is sort of a deeper topic that sort of, there's a little bit of, deserves a warning. This is sort of a quicksand. That theologies that are specific, and you can't sit down and look at theologies that are specific, in many cases have statements in them and beliefs that pit one person against another in terms of how they exist. And this, in many cases, spills over into violence. And this can be seen in, let's take the sort of the theist approach of things. The theist is a person who believes in a God-centered society, and that the hierarchical structure of society, in terms of the orders of society, is based on this theological hierarchy. If there is another person of the same supposed theological background, this is the difference between Sunni and Shia, let's say, look at the Muslims. Well, all of a sudden now, because one doesn't have the same belief as the other, they can call the other one heretic and go after and kill them. And this is what we see in a lot of the jihadists. Their targets of the jihadists, in addition to being American, if you look at what all the targets are, they're going after other Muslims, they're going after other people who believe in Islam, because their belief in Islam is not the same as the other person's belief in Islam. And this can actually be seen in history when you have the Roman Catholics go off in their crusades. Arguably, their propaganda machine said that they were going after the Muslims in the Middle East. But if you actually looked at what they did and you look at how the Crusades unfolded, and this is how the United States, this is sort of the impetus of how the United States formed. The first Crusade is the Norman invasion of England, where they wiped out the church in England there that was opposed to the papacy. So what happens? You had a pre-papal church in England that refused to bend and kneel to the papacy. The papacy sent in its army under the Normans and wiped out that church and then installed its own church. Under the old church, the pre-papal church, because the view of the earlier Christian, this is the theological view of the Christians pre-papal, pre-1000 AD, was the church of a brotherhood, was the church of the family, and sort of pushed because your brother, because your family, because God's your father, the need for a stately church wasn't needed and never really formed. And so everyone in society, because they're everyone, you view everyone as children of God, as your brothers and sisters, you really didn't have a ranking in society. And this kind of bothered a lot of people who were more royally royally oriented. And many of the German Europeans, the white Europeans, were of this persuasion. And so in 1064, you had the first Norman invasion. I think it was 1060 or 1066, around that area, around 1000 AD. You had the Norman invasion of England. And in the process, not only did they wipe out all the churches, but they wiped out all the monks, nuns, and priests, except for one, and installed their own church. They took out the family rule and law in terms that there wasn't any hereditary, there wasn't any structure, and imposed a hierarchical structure in England. This hierarchical structure had its problems, and this produced in around 1300 AD, this produced the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta then produced, many years later on, the American Constitution. So this is the American connection to this in terms of how theology plays out. But we can see that certain religions on the right can cause significant problems and can cause wars in between people, and this is sort of what we're seeing now. And there's the assumption on the left that somehow the left is more altruistic, the left is not as violent, that it rejects all this violence, the violence of what they call religion and theology. But if you look into its history, and its history starts basically at around 1900, and you look into its history and see what's actually happening, and you have to accept the horrors of the communism in Russia. You have to take into account Nazism, which is a national socialism, is socialism on the right. You also have to take into account the actions of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And when you start putting this stuff together and looking at some of the stuff that we saw in China, with some of the stuff we saw in Burma, you now have to start backing off from the statement that atheism and an atheistic society is significantly less violent than what you would have if you were talking about a theist right or a society on the right. And what happens is that again, none of this stuff, none of these arguments are brought out in in the primaries. There is a push by one side or the other to get Romney to the finishing line, even though he's not really near the finishing line. He's halfway between 600 and 700 in terms of his delegates, but he needs 1,200 delegates to really. He needs to really clinch it. He needs 1,100 delegates to clinch it. The full number is 1144. That is the actual clinching number. to say that he has the nomination locked up. If he doesn't get the 1144, what you have is now you're going to have a brokered convention in Florida. So that's sort of where they are now. But as what happens is that as you start looking into a large chunk of uh, the arguments on the left and right in terms of how violence plays out, uh, we can look at seeing what's going on in Syria, and we're just going to take this argument a little bit further, and as we see and understand the violence of Muslims against Muslims, and stretch this further and say, and do an analysis now on Syria and the Republican call with Senator John McCain calling for the support of these Muslim rebels who are fighting in Syria. What you look at, if you go into the Syrian events and you begin to see what's happening, it begins with sectarian violence. It begins with Muslim on Muslim violence. It begins with Muslim on Christian violence. This is something we've seen in Egypt against the Christian Copts. We've seen this now actually in Iraq, where many Iraqis and some of the Libyan Christians who are there in Libya are now fearing for their lives because they now have to leave because you're now having cleansing of entire neighborhoods. You're having history is kind of repeating itself in these areas. If you go back and look at the creation of Pakistan, and Pakistan was part of India at one point in time, and you see the creation of Pakistan, what you see is you'll see the Muslims, and this will give you an idea that this whole Muslim issue about attacking America is really baloney. It's not real. The Muslim argument of attack is against anyone who isn't of their view of Islam. And this can be seen in the breakup of India and the formation of Pakistan. And when Pakistan formed, you had all these Muslim gangs going out there and murdering and pushing out the Hindus who were in Pakistan. And this is where a large chunk of the issue is that Pakistan overlaps into the area of Punjab. And the Punjabis aren't Muslims, they're Sikhs. The Sikhism, the Sikhs this is where they're primarily in the areas in Punjab. So when the Muslims pushed into this area, they began pushing all of the Hindus, the Sikhs, all these people. They began pushing them out. Anyone who didn't leave who didn't want to leave was murdered, and whole villages were slaughtered. Whole villages were slaughtered. So what happens is that this whole Muslim thing, the jihad, is not an issue that's aimed at America. It's aimed at creating an Islamic, a Muslim world. And it is, as history shows it to be, a violent movement. There are some now who are becoming apologists and saying that this is a perversion of Islam. But if you actually go and look at the history and see what's gone on in history, you'll see that this isn't true. You'll see that throughout history, from the development of Muslims from 800 AD from 800 AD on, you'll see this violence, an enormous amount of violence on the Muslim side. This is not to excuse what we saw with the Crusades, with the so-called Christians, the Roman Catholics, and their call to a crusade or a holy war. But we see that you have in Syria a very complex environment where you have societies and people who believe in war, who believe that you could and should, and because of God's law, that you must convert people to Islam at the point of a sword. And here we have on the other side, we say, then we hear, without understanding this and without mentioning this, on Anderson Cooper, we have Senator John McCain coming up and saying we must help these people with humanitarian aid. And we see now that the United States is following with the United Kingdom in supporting and supplying the rebels, even though they say they're supplying them with humanitarian aid. You can find other sources out there, a lot of other sources out there, that shows that they were supplying them with military weapons right from the beginning. That this so-called peaceful uprising was not a peaceful uprising, that it had been armed from the beginning, and this was a push to destabilization in the same manner that they had pushed to destabilize Pakistan. A lot of the destabilization and the bombings that we're seeing in Pakistan, which are occurring even as we speak, just yesterday, talking about the news today, one of the headlines in Pakistan is you had multiple, not one or two bombings, you had multiple bombings across Pakistan. And this is all, they're all, and this isn't an American bombing a Muslim. This is a Muslim, these extremist Muslims from the Taliban, from Al Qaeda, bombing, attacking other Muslims because they're not as Muslim as they are, as the Taliban wants people to be. And so we see from history, again, you're going back in history to see what was done and what was the outcome of our intervention in particular areas. All you do is look at Pakistan to see what has happened with American policy in terms of how we deal with these issues. You want to see another example of American policy? Afghanistan. We've been in Afghanistan as part of American foreign policy since 1980. It was part of the Cold War. And so we haven't resolved any problem in Afghanistan. We haven't resolved any problem in Pakistan. We really haven't resolved anything in Iraq. But now we're going to go in and try to say we're going to do something in Syria. But at the same time, while we're going and calling Assad this war criminal, and we're talking about his wife, how his wife can be so blind to what's going on inside of Syria, we have in the news again, and they go across a variety of different headlines. This is confirmed with many Israeli peace groups and many Israeli peace activists that the Israeli government is behaving in the exact same manner and has had a history of ethnically cleansing Palestinians and people they call Bedouins in the Palestinian and Israeli area. We've got to a point now where it's no longer an issue of a two-state solution because Israel has confiscated so much land, has put so many conditions on it now, that we're looking now at basically an apartheid state. We're seeing a state in which one group of people have more rights than the other, and the others are primarily subhuman beings who are being treated like animals and by like press. And they actually talk about in the Israeli press about the Palestinian problem, about the Bedouin problem, as if they're talking about, and the irony here, this is the exact same language in terms of finding a solution to these problems that you heard Nazi and under Nazi Germany about how do you solve the Jewish problem. But they don't see it because, again, if you look at the psychology of things, you can say, well, how can a Jew, how can an Israeli be as bad as a Nazi? And it's very simple. The psychology is right there. A person who is abused as a child is more than likely, if there is not some form of intervention to sort of to pull back the violence, that as the cycle of violence continues, that kid who is abused will more than likely grow up to be an abuser. So what's happening? The Israeli Jews who are in Israel, there who are all these right wing settlers who are pushing for these policies to eliminate the Palestinians and the Bedouins from the land there. They're trying to ethnically cleanse the whole area. They're doing what they were taught by their German parents. And I'm not talking about now about what was done to the Jews in Germany. So what we're doing is we're seeing this cycle of Nazism in the form of Zionism being repeated in a manner that is in many ways you can see the abuser, the Nazi abuser, in this new Zionist generation, and you can see the things that were done and the markings, the way the Jews were marked after Kristallnacht, after when they had the Jewish star on them. You can see the exact same things being done to the Palestinians. You can see the marks on the Palestinians. You can see the treatment in Gaza as Auschwitz, where everything that Gaza has, including the fuel for its electric plants, all has to be approved by the Israeli government. The Israeli government controls everything, every step movement in there. They can control what houses are built, how much water they have, how much food they have, everything, down to the very tiniest details. All life in Gaza is controlled. And as you get these uprisings, any human rights activists will understand that if you oppress people for long enough, at some point in time, they're going to revolt against you. And these revolts, the latest one we saw in 2009, and they still are being, but this very violently put down. And so there was a call to the UN, to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, saying, hey, if we're going to be calling Assad to the criminal court, if we're going to be calling Gaddafi to the criminal court, if we're going to be calling Hosni Mubarak to the court, what's his name? The Egyptian president to the International Criminal Court, why shouldn't you call a Western government like Israel to the International Criminal Court? Why shouldn't they be investigated? And the prosecutor simply turned around and said, well, the Palestinians aren't an official state. And basically, you have the ICC, you see the racism, you see this whole thing of these hate crime things about this visible minority in the ICC. It is a Eurocentric, it is a white Western leaning court, and they exempt themselves from all the laws. And if you are not part of this list, this elitist list, then you're fair game for this law in terms of we're going to overturn your government. In terms of you have to listen to us, you need to obey us. This, and the UN is not a monarchy. It is a socialist system. It is what socialism is. Is what happens is that the government rules over you, and if you're not part of the approved minority, if you're not part of the approved society list, then you don't exist. And you will be continuously oppressed by this government because you're not on this visible minority list. Anyways, here's where Syria needs to understand this, and Syria needs to sort of really act. The easiest way for a government like Syria, the easiest way for an attack on Syria or China, is when you have a dictator. The dictator is the normal reaction is to shut off the press and to shut down the internet. This is exactly how and what the U.S. and what European governments want. They want to show a dictator. They want to show and be able to demonize the person on the air. If you allow open press, if your hospitals are open and free and are treating everybody equally, then this is not an issue, because you'll always find in the blogosphere, you will always find on the internet, you will always find reporters and journalists who are fair-minded, who will break the mold, who will break out of the oppression done by the West, who will break out of the Western mindset, who will break out of the Western thought control and say, no, there isn't a visible minority and an invisible minority that you can attack and can attack. We are all human beings, and we all should be treated equally. And if you're going to set up an international crimes court and you're going to start trying people, then everybody needs to be subject to this court. And if they are not, the court needs to be dismantled and considered to be invalid. And I think you can bring this argument. Any dictator, I'm talking particularly Assad now, or into China, that you can change the society. Look at what China has done. China, and this is what India did too, who was a social society, as they brought in some of these more free laws about free enterprise, they started prospering. Look at all you have to do is look at and compare China and India, which is more republican, which is more free, than what you see in Europe, to see the difference. And so if Assad was smart, if Assad is smart, he'll do the exact same thing that China. He'll start moving towards democracy. Anyways, that's it for tonight. Look at the down below bar. You will see the episode 4 for Daniel Yergin's The Prize will be up. And I will see you tomorrow night.